Beyond the headlines. This is World Insight.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. France hosts this year's G7 summit starting Monday. According to its official agenda, reducing global imbalances is a top priority. Many suggest this summit comes at a critical time. Global governance faces strain on multiple fronts, while the transatlantic rift on trade and defense deepens. At the same time, middle powers are winning growing influence in global affairs. With the G20 and APEC still ahead, this summit offers a glimpse about if the traditional Western alignment still works or not. Many more are also asking if the G20 could really turn its theme into actions. On these and more, let's loop in our panelists. Joining us in Washington, D.C., Charles Kupchan, Senior Fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. Also in D.C., Saurabh Gupta, Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist. And in Tokyo, Benoit Jatran, Faculty Lecturer from the Temple University. And in Beijing, last but not least, the Liu Mingli Research Fellow at the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. The G7 summit can be the talk of the week. Now, it is not only enlarged in scale, but also enlarged on the topics. So can you tell me, Mr. Kupchan, your thoughts on the expectation of the summit? What is likely to be achieved?
I would say I have reasonably low expectations for the outcome for two different reasons. One is we are on the eve of what appears to be an agreement to end the conflict between the United States and Iran and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. That will, to some extent, dominate the summit in a way that was unexpected. There'll be discussions about where we go from here, about the role the G7 partners may play in getting the Strait of Hormuz reopened, getting shipping started up as quickly as possible. And the other reason I have low expectations is that this is a moment of unique friction, tension among the advanced democracies. I think President Trump is someone who has, to some extent, walked away from the traditional multilateralism of the United States that has created a certain amount of distrust and undermined the solidarity that you sometimes see among G7 partners. And so I think it's going to be hard for President Macron, the host, to forge a consensus on the key issues. So, yeah, though there may be some announcements about rebalancing trade, perhaps about setting up some framework for advancing the ball on the development of AI, but I'm not expecting there to be huge outcomes from this meeting.
Mr. Jatran, from the European perspective, how do you see the G7 summit likely to have much result?
We know that since last year, since 2025, there have been quite major cracks between the European members of the G7, the European Union as a whole, and the United States. So this started, of course, when Donald Trump came back to the White House in early 2025. I think these cracks have appeared on so many fronts, on many issues of global importance, of many issues of importance to the G7 members in Europe. Trump has shown a propensity to act in a way that has been completely different from the traditional American approach, be it on when it comes to his military interventions that we have seen over the last few months, as well as a traditional approach towards allies, and that includes the EU and NATO more specifically. So I think Europeans will go in this meeting hoping to maybe have at least a communique, which did not happen last year. As my colleague said as well, perhaps some kind of framework for AI, which is something we expect. But as far as something more overarching or more significant deals, I think the expectations indeed are quite low.
Over the weekend, Mr. Gupta, we've already been hearing news about a few thousand strong protesters in Geneva against the G7 meeting. They denounced the so-called fascism and imperialism represented by the G7, this group itself. Now, how much do you think G7 as a concept is still relevant today? And how do you see the different voices we're seeing these days about the mechanism?
I would say the G7 is relevant because the global north needs to have a commonality of purpose. The hope is thereafter that that commonality of purpose, if it arises, and it's not going to arise because there isn't that common purpose, but the hope is that if there is that commonality of purpose, that that conversation then can then be had with the global south. We can't just have a G7 talking about its agenda and trying to impose its agenda, and the BRICS and the global south talking about what it wants, and the two not meeting and finding a framework in which they can regulate, transact, and have productive relations. But I think the G7 does need to get its act in order, and the G7 is a very significant player in many respects. What's happening in France is exactly the reason the G7 was formed. The Arab oil price crisis in early 1970s, inflation, breakdown of the monetary order at that point of time. That is the reason we had the G7 in the first place. Those are very relevant today in this age of global fragmentation and economic insecurity. But whether the global north this time around can get its act in order on these issues, it's hard to see that happening, and frankly, and somewhat disturbingly, they're now then thereafter trying to use issues like overcapacity and China as a kind of a binding glue, but that's not really going to work out. But at the end of the day, global north and global south need to have commonality of purpose, need to reach out to each other. I would like to have seen more global south leaders here. I'd like to see global north, maybe the G7 chair invited to the BRICS summit, and let's bring them together on the same table and let's have a solid discussion on the issues that matter.
So let's go to Mr. Liu. Certainly, China is not a member of the G7, even though China has been invited by the French president to participate. So do leaders coming from UAE, Egypt, from Qatar, as well as coming from other developing as well as emerging economies. How do you see the functionality of G7 today?
In the past decades, G7 to a large extent dominates international affairs, particularly in economic issues. But for the time being, the share of G7 has narrowed, and its influence has in the process of declining. I think that's the background. Let's take the G7 summit as an example. We have heard the views of our colleagues that we don't have high expectation for this summit. I think that's the background. G7 is important, but not as important as it used to be. For the time being, we have other mechanisms like the G20, like the BRICS. We have all these kind of options. And the G7, yes, it's good that it discuss many important issues this time, but I think it will be better if it can produce some difference in reality.
Mr. Kapchan, you talk about the importance of Iran-US deal. There has been media reports about an agreement being reached by two sides. Both sides seem to, at this moment, confirmed about some kinds of framework, but as we see, the zigzagging road to any framework has always been quite dramatic over the past few months.
The deal is really the beginning of the story. It's not the end of the story. But I do think that it creates an atmosphere that is upbeat for the G7, because until this deal was struck, all the parties were looking at a global energy crisis that was only worsening their domestic situation and the affordability crisis at home. Rising gas prices. Those gas prices were affecting everything from fertilizer to food to transportation. These are economic conditions that pose very significant challenges across the board, including to liberal democracy. And frankly, I think Trump had to make a deal because he's heading into the midterms. This war went sideways from his perspective. He didn't expect Iran to be able to fight back as it did and to close the Strait of Hormuz. So now there is breathing room. You're already seeing the price of oil drop significantly. But I do think that there will be a lot of discussion in Avion about where we go from here, especially because you will have around the table for some of the meetings a significant group of countries from the Gulf region, from the Middle East. And there needs to be a consensus about a whole set of issues over which Iran and the United States so far haven't been able to find common ground. The future of enrichment, what to do with the highly enriched uranium, what to do with Iran's missile program, what role allies will play in the Middle East in trying to get the shipping back up to the level that it was before. G7 summits, I think, have a strength in that they are not orchestrated, they're not fixed, and that gives them the ability to go with the flow, to make decisions and to set the agenda in accordance with what's going on. And so I do think that some of the issues that were originally on the agenda, the longer term questions of inequality, of growth in the developing world, of trade imbalances, they may end up taking a back seat. The urgent is going to displace the important. And so I do think that you'll get a lot of discussion on Iran and where we go from here.
Right. Some experts are already talking about this is an interesting case study about how a middle-sized economy are trying to interact with the largest economy and the largest military power in the world, the United States, and eventually what the result is. So how do you see that discussion is likely to shape a expanded G7 summit that we're likely to see later this week?
The G7 has already changed dramatically. It's no longer a closed club of the largest liberal democracies, the largest advanced economies. Now, as a matter of course, you have countries from the global south. You have a conversation that brings others to the table. And I think in some ways what we're seeing here is a transition to a different kind of international system where you're going to see a lot more major power, middle power interaction. We're going to see more and more G7, BRIC, G20, different groupings come together to address different issues. Although I would say that one thing is missing. We need to see more conversation that takes place across ideological and geopolitical dividing lines. We need formats where China, the United States, India, Russia are at the table.
To you, Mr. Liu, how much the G7 summit that is reflecting on the what many call the multipolarized world? How is China looking at this multipolarized world, and also the thoughts on G7 at this moment?
I think there are a lot of criticism about the G7 group because it's not as representative as it used to be. This time, we see some middle powers attending this summit. Is a good sign that the rich countries now they have more considerations about the small or middle-sized economies. That's very good. And the challenge is that we see an expanded G7 mechanism, but how can we see a more efficient G7 mechanism? That's the real challenge. Yes, discussions are important. We need concrete results to solve the realistic challenges facing this world: the security, the economic imbalances, and the AI management of AI. There's a lot of hard issues we need to resolve, and we need to see the result.
We see both sides, China, US, reached a consensus during the presidential meetings with one another earlier in April, talking about track one dialogue, meaning governmental dialogue on AI governance. Do we see much is happening since then?
AI is a very, very important issue, not only for G7, but for the globe. But even within the G7, we still see some differences about how to manage this AI. For the United States, I think AI, to a large extent, is the engine of economic growth, is the sign of the economic competitiveness of the United States. But for the Europe, I think they see the AI in a different way. They think how to manage the AI. They see the negative effect of this AI technology. For China also have some leverage in this issue. When we bring Europe, United States, and China together, we will see different attitude toward this issue. That's why multilateralism is important.
We have seen Anthropic's latest LLMs being banned by the US government, and the company itself decided to take it off the shelf, so to speak. And there has been increasing debate about what is security that we are looking at, what are the obligations. and the scale of responsibility for those who are making the LLMs, their relationship with the government, and what about beyond the borders?
I think we are very, very early in this debate, and the technology is running far, far ahead of the politics. And that's in part because many politicians, many diplomats, they don't have the technical expertise to talk about LLMs, to talk about high-end semiconductors. And so there is, I think, a need for the diplomatic community, the people that are going to the G7, that are around the table, to have more interaction, more connective tissue with the high-tech community, because we need to bring down those divisions. So I do think that this is a debate that is going to pick up speed over time. And that's because I do think that governments are going to be more and more concerned about AI and its impact, not just on international relations, but on domestic politics, its impact on labor markets, how our societies are integrating AI on a daily basis into business practices and into commerce. And so this is in some ways the very earliest stages of this debate.
Right.
I do think the G7 has an important role to play here in standing up the kinds of bodies and working groups that need to be stood up. But as I said earlier, I also think this is a conversation that has to take place with China, with Russia, with other countries that have a very different approach to regulation and the management of their own domestic AI and high-tech communities.
How to be inclusive rather than exclusive, especially at this early stage. So let me also ask you about that, Mr. Gupta, since you have been doing research about China and the US, two AI major powers in the world when it comes to technology. What's your thoughts on whether this G7 summit, this platform, can be relevant given what you see today about the nature of this discussion on the AI?
A conversation, I think, between Europe, America, and China on AI, and exclusively on AI. They are the major players, China and the United States. They have a bilateral framework going forward, and hopefully that would be useful. We have to understand that, the G7 initially was not really about multilateralism. It was the global North getting together, having a common purpose, and their agenda was then multilateralized thereafter, and they had the power to do so. Right now, they don't have that sort of power to do so. And so we need to have other bodies, other players included. And AI is a perfect example of that conversation. And therefore, my view is that the US, China, and the United States need to sit down and just have a forum to discuss AI and to discuss international economic matters.
You were suspicious about the intention by some in the G20 summit, try to antagonize China and using that as a glue, so to speak, using your analogy, to bring everybody, quote unquote, together.
G7 is not trying to do a multilateral agenda. It's trying to do a like-minded nations agenda. And that like-minded nations agenda is selecting those selective few countries with which it will work. Take the case of India out here. And not just in the G7 context. India has been coming to G7 summits for a long time. I don't know whether that has been fruitful or useful in any way, but they have been up to a point being able to append India to their common purposes to whatever extent. And this has been also the global North has tried to work. Why is South Africa not there? But Kenya is there. Kenya is the most kind of Western adjacent African country, but should it be there? I don't know. I don't think it should be, frankly, there, or should be a more representative country. And I'd even have maybe the Nigerians, if they can get their act together out there. But that's the point. Even with the Democratic administration, they talk about multilateralism, but it was essentially the global North and a select few like-minded nations who they want along and then craft that international system. And that is not going to work. That is not the day we live in. And it's not really brought that much benefit either for both sides in that regard. And so I would like to see a China, EU, US dialogue at the forefront on many issues that range from development to geoeconomics. And I think there'll be much can be achieved. And that agenda can then be multilateralized, say at the G20 thereafter.
So, Mr. Ahdi Shahtan, it seems that your colleague is saying, don't use the other countries as so-called the decorations, but rather focusing on the real issue to make sure it could work. That is an urgent matter for the G7 summit. Agree or not?
The G7 remains a grouping that was created very much for the purpose, the explicit purpose of bringing together the most industrialized Western countries of the world, which I said earlier happen to be liberal democracies as well. When we're looking for more inclusive mechanisms, we have the G20 as well, which, let's remember, the G20 was created a couple of decades ago for that very purpose, in order to make sure that we did not have only Western-oriented groupings discussing matters of global importance. The G20 includes China, includes South Africa, and other BRICS members as well. So we have these different groupings for different purposes.
When you have smaller groups, the so-called like-minded group, some kinds of consensus apparently can be easier, faster. When you have a more inclusive group, the result of discussion can take longer time sometimes. So how do you see the earlier belief of so-called efficiency vis-a-vis the real results?
There are trade-offs. I think small is good. The fewer seats at the table, the easier it is to forge consensus. The more like-minded the states around the table, the easier it is to forge consensus. But that's not the world that we live in today, right? We are in a situation in which we are seeing a rapid diffusion of power. We are in a situation in which many countries, from India to Turkey to Nigeria to South Africa to Brazil, are playing the field. And as also we were talking about before, our multilateral institutions have been dominated by states and state actors. You now have a need to put at the table, if you're talking about AI, NVIDIA and Tencent and ByteDance and OpenAI, right? There needs to be representatives from the private sector. So I do think that it's going to be difficult to find the right groupings, but when it comes to a world in transition, we need to be flexible. We need to find the right mix between inclusive and too big. We need to find formats to bridge the divides in a world where collective action is by the day becoming harder to achieve, but more urgent.
But given the fact that we see many are seeing the world, some are seeing the world as the rules of the jungle, do you think that there is a possibility to do it? And how do you think the day-to-day communication can build more confidence and trust among different important players so that eventually any kinds of multilateral platforms can work?
That's a very good question. First of all, I don't think it's a good idea just to bring the like-minded countries together. Are we going back to the Cold War thinking? No, I think you want to really want to solve an issue, we need to bring the countries who are most relevant together. For example, to achieve the peace in Middle East, we need to bring Iran. If we want to achieve the peace in Ukraine, we need to Russia. So we need to bring the countries who are relevant together, not the kind of G7, this kind of grouping. And for the future, I think is a time we abandon the Cold War thinking, and we need to bring the countries who are mostly contribute to the work to provide public goods to this globe. That's very important. We just have a narrow thinking that we put our own country's interest first. No, that's particularly for major countries. We need to provide public goods to the global society.
How do you see likely should be our expectation for a platform like G7 summit at this moment?
I mean, my only point and my main point is that no major geopolitical issue can be resolved without having China at the table. They need to find a way to engage China in some format and in a credible, honest framework to tackle these subjects. Otherwise, the purpose of the G7 to kind of set the multilateral agenda itself will be defeated.
I think the G7 remains relevant given the recent tensions between the U.S. and other members of the G7. I think our expectations need to be pretty modest when it comes to agreements between all members of the G7.
You know, despite relatively low expectations, I think it's going to be a generally good summit because it comes in the immediate aftermath of the deal between the United States and Iran. Had that not been the case, I think there would have been a lot of finger pointing. There is an important relationship here on the trade front that I think the G7 can work in cooperation with China.
To solve global issues, we need global order rather than regional summits. Actually, we have this kind of international order, like the framework of United Nations. What we need to do is to uphold these institutions and orders rather than withdrawing from them.
That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. Thanks for being with me. Bye for now.